Good day, my name is Bailey Bataille, and today we will be discussing the firm's production and costs. We must understand that costs and production are related to the firm. And so, whenever the firm decides to produce more, their costs increase. Let's begin our analysis with the firm's production function. The factors of production used by the firms can be divided into two groups: fixed and variable. Fixed factors of production can be trucks or the manufacturing plant. This means that if the firm decides to produce more, they do not have to buy a new truck or to build a new plant. But variable factors of production increase as the firm increases production. Examples of these variable factors: energy, natural resources, and labor. We will focus on labor because the human factor will shape production and cost. Now, let's divide production into three categories. Total production, which is of course the amount of goods produced when labor is hired. Average production, which can easily be calculated by dividing the total production of the firm by the number of workers that the firm has hired. And then we have marginal production. Marginal production of labor means that for each additional unit of labor hired, for each additional worker, we ask ourselves, how much does the firm produce more? Because humans do not behave in a mechanical manner, labor can display increasing marginal returns or decreasing marginal returns. To understand this better, let's take an example. If I have a company and I only have 5 workers that are employed, then I likely rent one office space that I share with them and I can monitor their activities. The workers have to be hard at work from beginning of day till end of day. But as my company grows and I hire more and more workers, I cannot monitor all workers. Hence, I have to hire managers to monitor the workers, and since the managers have less at stake, then the monitoring process starts to become less efficient. And so some workers begin to email during work, maybe conversate with each other a little bit more. When this happens, worker productivity displays diminishing marginal returns, which means that as I hire more and more workers, I have to pay the same salary to each worker, but the efficiency of the firm has decreased. If we look at the impact of this behavior on the total production curve and on the marginal production curve, we notice that the total production curve will have one point of inflection. At the beginning, as I hire more and more workers, my firm becomes more and more efficient very rapidly. But as the number of workers becomes too large and inefficiencies set in, then the total production does increase, but at a slower and slower rate. Hence, the curve flattens. If we look at the marginal production, we see that for most of the production range, the marginal production of hiring an extra labor decreases, which means that as I hire more and more workers, it is not that the worker that I hire is less efficient, it is the fact that we have more workers that makes the firm less efficient. And now, let's look at costs. Now that we are considering the cost of production, we must understand that they're going to be associated with the production function that we just described. Hence, we must keep in mind that the decreasing marginal return of the labor will affect the cost for the firm. Now, we will look at different types of cost, notably the total cost, which is obviously the cost of all resources used in the production of the good that the firm produces, the total fixed cost, which is the cost associated with all of the fixed factors of production that we discussed earlier, such as the truck and the manufacturing plant, and the total variable costs, which depend on how much energy, natural resources, but also how much labor the firm uses. Of course, the total cost will be the sum of the fixed and of the variable cost. But we will find it difficult to work with total cost, especially when we want to illustrate these curves. And so, we will have to work with a scaled down cost. We will work with the average total cost, which we simply get by dividing the total cost by the quantity of output, the average fixed cost, which we get by dividing the total cost by the quantity of output, the average variable cost, which again we get by dividing the total cost associated with variable factors of production by the total output. And finally, we will have to work with the marginal cost, which is the increase in total costs that is incurred by the firm when they want to produce one more good. This one will be very important. Again, the average total cost will be the sum of the average fixed cost and of the average variable costs. And now, let's look at a graph that has all these curves represented on it. This will be very important. This is where our entire analysis will culminate. We first notice that the average fixed cost falls over the production range. This makes sense since we only have one truck, one manufacturing plant, but we're producing more and more. Hence, that fixed cost is divided by more and more output that is being produced. We also notice that the average total cost stands high above the average fixed cost and the average variable cost. Well, that's because the average total cost is the sum of the average fixed cost and the average variable cost. We then notice that the average total cost falls very rapidly initially. This occurs because the average fixed cost is very important at first and falls very quickly as well. We must understand that the cost of a plant, the cost of the truck, are very high. When we produce one good, to get the average fixed cost, we just divide it by 1, and then we divide it by 2 when we produce 2 goods, and so on. Hence, it will fall very quickly, and of course, it represents a much higher cost than the variable cost at low levels of production. We must still explain two additional peculiarities of this graph. The first one will be the U-shaped nature of the average total cost and of the average variable cost. And the other one will be the efficient scale, which we'll have to define. What we notice is when the marginal cost is below the average total cost or the average variable cost, then the average total cost and the average variable cost fall. But when the marginal cost is above the average total cost or the average variable cost, then both of these curves rise. And so, we must ask ourselves why. To do this, we will use an example that is related to a student's grade all throughout the term. I will present in a table a student's marginal grade, which is actually the grade that the student gets for each quizzes that the student completes, and then the average grade at that time. When the student completes their first quiz and obtains a grade of 80, then of course the average so far in the class is of 80. Let's say that the first quiz was relatively easy and the student doesn't really prepare for the second quiz, has difficulty, and only obtains a grade of 40. Then we can very easily calculate the average grade to be 60. Let's say that the student then works a little harder for their third quiz and obtains a grade of 45, which is still higher than the preceding grade of 40. Well, since the student improved, we might ask ourselves, well, what will happen to the average grade of that student? What we notice is that the average grade is still decreasing. And even if the student does even better on the fourth quiz and obtains a grade of 51, the average grade is still decreasing. Only when the student obtains a grade of 59 will the average grade begin to increase slowly. And of course, when the student has an even better grade of 67, then the student's average moves to 57. Why does this occur? Because as long as the grade obtained by the student is inferior to the student average at the time, the average will continue to fall even if the student is making improvements. And as soon as the grade obtained by the student is higher than the average at that time, then that grade will pull the average up. And this is how we explain the U-shaped nature of both the average total cost and the average variable cost, as the marginal cost impacts them in much the same way. To conclude this lecture, let's look at the long run costs. The long run costs are actually obtained by looking at different short run costs that a firm could incur if it had different plant sizes or different fixed costs. This graph illustrates 4 different plant sizes that a firm could have. Each of them for different production ranges. Of course, the greater the plant, the greater the output. The minimum of each of the average total cost, which we call the efficient scale, because it's where the firm is at its most efficient, will be the point of production chosen by the firm. Since we have different potential plant size, if we link all of these efficient points in production together, we obtain what the firm will choose in the long run, as the firm will always try to optimize and to maximize profit. This concludes our presentation for today. Goodbye.